Pretty quick presentation for you on this one. So looking into our next topic for VCE physical education, which is looking at this idea of conducting an activity analysis. So as per VCAR, what you guys need to learn how to do is how to collect data for an activity analysis, how to conduct an analysis of skills, movement patterns, and work to rest ratios, and essentially how this practice of doing an activity analysis fits into the development of a training program. Let's imagine you've been employed as an exercise physiologist or a conditioning trainer for a sports team, or a personal trainer for a sports team or an individual, and your task is to design a training program for that team or that individual to improve their physiological performance in their chosen sport. Now, each time we go about developing a training program, there's certain things we need to do. We need to do some baseline testing, doing some fitness testing to see where they're at prior to the program. We need to develop a suitable program. And then after they've been implementing the program, we want to do some post-program testing to look at how they've gone in terms of improving and then evaluate that training program. But before you do any of that, you need to conduct an activity analysis. So an activity analysis is always the very first step that you would take in designing a training program. And what is it and why is it always the first step? So an activity analysis is when you analyse a person performing in whatever the chosen sport is that you're going to design a program for, and you would analyse an elite level of that particular sport, and you're analysing it for the purpose of determining how performance could be improved via the implementation of a training program. Or you could also conduct activity analyses in real time, and elite coaches do this all of the time, where they analyse a game. You'll see them in their coaches' boxes or walking up and down the field, and they're analysing performance, and they're doing that for the purpose of improving performance, often in that particular game. But for us in VCE PE, looking at training programs, we would analyse an activity to identify areas where performance can be improved via a training program. As I said before, it's important to do the activity analysis of an elite athlete, because there are differences between what's required in a particular sport from an elite athlete and an athlete performing at an amateur level. So by conducting your analysis at the elite level, you're getting a better indication of the skills that are required to perform that particular sport at a high level. And if you're tailoring your program to a particular person, or you're differentiating your program for a team to suit people playing different playing positions, obviously you should conduct the analysis on a person playing in the position that you're interested in. It can be pretty hard to undertake an activity analysis of some sports, particularly ones like AFL, for example, where it's such a big field and there's such a lot going on. It's hard to keep an eye on different people throughout the course of a game. So typically we say the best sports for undertaking activity analysis are often ones in a marked court, a relatively small court, like netball, basketball, volleyball, tennis, badminton, and sports that are predominantly intermittent in their nature. So if we're conducting an activity analysis, essentially what we're doing is we're collecting data, and then we're analysing that data to make some decisions about muscle groups to target, training methods to use in a training program. So collecting the data is important, and there's three ways that we do it. We can collect the data through observation. We can collect the data through statistical recording, or what's really common these days is we can collect the data digitally. And what we'll do now is we'll unpack each of those three methods and have a look at their pros and their cons. Direct observation is exactly as it says. That is when you are at that particular time watching a game, watching an athlete in that particular game, and you're analysing their performance. Now, just doing pure direct observation on its own, you're not so much recording anything statistically, you're not using any recording sheets, you're more just having your own observations of that particular player during the game, which is a common thing for coaches to do because they can make changes immediately within that game that can improve performance. When it comes down to planning a training program, direct observation would be the least effective method because it's obviously really subjective. As you can see down the bottom there though, that little disclaimer, the more highly experienced a coach is, generally they can avoid some of that said subjectivity and get some more accurate results. So over here we can whip through a couple of advantages and disadvantages. Main advantage is that you can make some changes in real time. You can detect player fatigue throughout a game, and the players are able to stay on the field and they don't have to come off necessarily, but you can rotate their positions to sort of increase player efficiency that way. So advantages really come down to just using this method during an actual game. Disadvantage, as we said before, it's subjective. You can talk to the players about how they've performed, but you can't give them any evidence to support that. And often players, as you would know, the more fatigued you become, the more harder you feel you're working mentally, even though that might not show in your performance. So telling an athlete that they're not working at their maximum when they're feeling completely knackered after a game is not as efficient as doing it if you can back it up with some data. Also, the data's lost then and there. You can't record it and keep track of it for sort of future reference. And you know, there's another list of disadvantages there as well. I won't talk through all of them. Statistical recording is a good method. It's definitely more reliable than direct observation, and it's often used in conjunction with direct observation. So you would be observing a particular game, and whilst you're observing it, you would be using some specific recording sheets, and you would be collecting data on specific components of that game. So you might be collecting data on the execution of particular skills, the range of skills used. You might collect some data on the number of high intensity sprints or the length of various sprints. You might be recording data on the ratio of work to rest of an athlete. And as I said before, you're using some sort of recording sheet to do that. So at the end, you actually do have some data to break down with the players themselves, which is a really good thing. Statistical observation, because you're generally going to collect data on a range of things, it's best done in a team, and at the elite level, there would be a coaching team with support staff that are collecting the data. And you can also, along with using it with direct observation, you can use statistical recording with our next method we're going to talk about, which is digital recording, which enhances it even further. Advantages, disadvantages. As I said before, you can discuss performance with the players more objectively. You can store the data for future reference. You can create player profiles, so you can build up a range of data on a player across a number of games. Large sample size is always going to be more accurate than just collecting some results on one particular game. That athlete could have had a bad match. Disadvantage, you need to spend a fair bit of time training people how to conduct the statistical recording. It can be hard to look down at a recording sheet and up at the field and not miss anything that's going on. It is rather labour intensive because you have to have a team of people doing it. And you can have some issues with vision and field of view if it gets obstructed during a game and you might miss something that's going on. Using digital recording to collect data is definitely the most accurate method of data collection, and at the elite level it would be the one that's getting used the most lately, and even at an amateur level I think digital recording is on the increase because it's just so much more accessible now for amateur sports teams to use. What does it involve? It involves exactly what the name says. You're recording data, but you're doing it digitally. So the benefit of that is, particularly if you're doing video recording, after the game you can stop, you can play it back, you can watch it, you can pause it as many times as you want to. So imagine doing your statistical recording, but doing it based on a video recording that's been taken. It's going to be far more accurate because you don't have to do it in real time, which is really good. You can also use other methods other than video recording. So digital recording can include things like your heart rate monitor at a pretty simple level, get you some good data on intensities. And GPS is a really common one that you also see used a lot, particularly in the AFL and a lot of other elite sports. And this thing down here, eye in the sky, that's that technology that's not so new now. We see it a fair bit. We've got sort of those cameras in the sky and a range of people using different cameras to get different angles to capture all of the players throughout the game. So you don't have to have someone on the side just trying to video one particular player. Advantages, disadvantages. So accurate collection of playing intensities. You can also analyse movement patterns with those intensities. You can make that recording available to other professionals such as biomechanists that can break down the skill technique more carefully. Disadvantages, it would be expensive. With GPS, there's a limit on the number of players that can be wearing one at any one time on the field. With heart rate monitors, you need to be relatively close to the receiver for the heart rate monitor, and wearing a watch on your wrist during the game is not ideal for a start, but also you've got problems with how far away people on the sideline recording the data can be. And the eye in the sky technology, because it's so many cameras, it can be pretty labour intensive, although it is becoming more and more digital. We're familiar with our data collection methods, so we know we're going to use some direct observation or some statistical recording or some digital recording. And at the end of the day, the best method is to use a combination of all three. Rarely would you use just one of those methods. You're going to use at least 2 out of the 3 in conjunction with one another, if not 3 out of the 3. So that's the best thing to do. What are we actually analysing though? Well, we're analysing 3 main things. And in VCE PE, these are the 3 things we're going to focus on: skill analysis, movement patterns, and work to rest ratios. And we're focusing on those with a focus on improving physiological performance through the data we gain. So activity analyses can collect data on physiological performance, psychological performance, technical performance, and tactical performance, such as decision making. Though it can get you data on all of those 4 things, we're only going to focus on one of them, which is collecting data that can be used to improve physiological performance. And to collect that sort of data, these are the 3 things we'll be looking at. If we're doing a skills analysis on a particular game, what we're recording is the types of skills being used in the game and the frequency at which those skills are being performed. To add another element, you could also record the effectiveness of the skill, so how many times it's executed well and how many times it's executed poorly. So skills analysis, what it would look like, you'd have some sort of chart. The chart would have the players' names on it. It would have the different skills that are common for that particular game. And you can see this little table up here lists a few that are common in a few different sports. And across the course of the game, you would be tallying up a frequency of how often each skill is performed. Why would we do that? In this particular situation, we're not doing that to improve the skill itself. We're looking at the skills used so that we can gain data to identify the main muscle groups that are being used to execute those skills. So then we can design a training program that targets the particular muscle groups that are most important for that sport. It would be pretty pointless designing a resistance training program with a lot of leg work in it, if the player that you're watching predominantly uses their upper body. So it's really important that we do identify the main muscles being used, then we can make sure they're the ones we're training, and then therefore if we improve strength in those muscles and power in those muscles, that should improve execution of the skills, and then that should result in improved performance. Another area we can gather data on is movement patterns. So if we're analysing movement patterns, essentially what we're doing is we're either watching a field of play as it's occurring, or we're looking back at some data that's been collected on something as a GPS, and we're collecting data on different types of movement. So that movement could be distances covered from running or walking, could be the types of movements occurring such as jumping or rotating, moving forwards, moving backwards, moving sideways, getting up and down off the ground. All of that sort of stuff is different types of movement patterns. So by getting data on movement patterns, what we can do is we can replicate those movement patterns in a training program and make sure that athletes are training for those movement patterns that they're going to be executing in a game. We've got two methods of collecting data on movement patterns. The first method is related to this diagram up the top here, which is where you're actually conducting your analysis on the sideline of a game while it's occurring. And what you would do to do that is you would prepare a little scale drawing like this one up the top, where you can, as you're watching the game, you can sort of draw a line across here saying, yep, athlete ran about this far. You can go, yep, athlete jumped in this region of the court here. Athlete was jogging from about halfway to the goal key over there. And then after you've recorded all those movements on your graph, you can then work backwards and calculate how far each of those distances are, get some data on how often they spend walking, running, jogging, sprinting, jumping, blocking, etc., etc. I suppose you could also do that watching a recording back as well. But we do say the method's not particularly accurate and it is a little bit subjective, and I'm sure you can appreciate how hard it would be continually glancing down and recording on this data sheet and bringing your eyes back up to watch exactly what's going on in the field of play. So the second method we use to gather data is more accurate and becoming more and more popular, and that's using GPS technology. So by using GPS technology, what we can do is we can get data on all of these things down in this box here. We can also get some data on what fitness components are most commonly being used. We can get some data on fatigue by comparing movement patterns at the start of the game to midway through the game or to the end of the game. And essentially by doing that, we can make sure we target training so that athletes are training for the movement patterns that they're going to be using in a game. The final thing we're going to talk about in terms of what we can collect data on is work to rest ratios, which gives us some data on playing intensities. So we've already talked about now getting data on skills analysis. We've talked about doing an analysis of movement patterns. So now we're up to an analysis of work to rest ratios, which is pretty straightforward because, as the name suggests, we are recording how much time an athlete spends working compared to how much time the athlete spends resting throughout that game. So resting is not necessarily passive resting. Generally, when we're talking about this stuff, we're considering anything above 70% sort of their max heart rate, if you like, as work, whereas anything below 70% is rest. So what you would do is you would watch a game or watch a recording of a game back, and you would just keep a tally of how often that person is working or is resting. If we're doing it based on intensity and we're looking at percentages of heart rates, for example, or percentages of VO2 max, obviously you're going to need some digital recording data to do that post the game. If we're talking about work to rest ratios through direct observation, there are performers templates you can use where you're making the judgments of when they're walking, when they're jogging, when they're sprinting, etc. So it does make it a little bit more subjective, but certainly makes it a bit more accessible to do in more amateur sports. With work to rest ratios, so particularly what they're relating to is energy systems and energy system interplay, so that we can target our training to develop the predominant energy system being used in that particular sport. So you can see over here, work to rest ratios greater than a ratio of 1 to 7, so 1 being work, 7 being rest, so you're resting 7 times more than you're working. That would indicate that the ATP PC system is predominant for that activity. If the work to rest ratio is a bit smaller, whereas you're resting 3 times more than you're working or 5 times more than you're working, we're looking at anaerobic glycolysis. And if you've got a work to rest ratio that's about 1 to 1, so evenly balanced, then we're targeting the aerobic energy system.